Hello, hello. Welcome to English Extras. My name is Jean. If you're here, it's because you don't want to sound like a textbook. You're in the right place. This podcast is to help intermediate and advanced learners find alternatives to textbook English so you can express yourself authentically. Before we begin, if you want the transcript for this episode, you can follow the link in the description. Reading and listening at the same time is a great way to improve your English. And I also include definitions of words and phrases I use in the episode, as well as example sentences at the end of each transcript. Ready? Let's begin. For this episode, I'm going to tell you about my summer vacation, specifically going to an enormous event called SummerSlam, as well as one of my husband's favorite places in my hometown. This episode will include vocabulary regarding travel, descriptions of places, descriptions of events, and opinions. It will also offer some insight into two specific areas of American culture, aka yard sales and entertainment wrestling. So, I live in Florida, close to Miami, but I was born in central Kentucky. All of my family still lives there, along with quite a few of my best friends. So, once a year, my husband and I pack up our dog and cranky cat into our 2016 Toyota Corolla and drive about 1,500 kilometers. In American terms, that's 1,000 miles or 15 hours. The way we do it is, to go to Kentucky, my husband and I wake up at 2:45 in the morning, get the animals in the car, and start driving. To drive from our city to Orlando, we take the Florida Turnpike. The important thing to know about the Florida Turnpike is that it is unbelievably tedious. It's mostly straight and flat and with absolutely nothing to look at out the window. It is so boring that I am at risk of falling asleep behind the wheel if I have to drive on it at 3 o'clock in the morning. So, my husband drives first. Just north of Orlando, we get off the turnpike onto I-75. The I in I-75 is the first letter of the word interstate, which is another word for highway. I-75 is very convenient for us because we get on it around Orlando and don't get off it until we arrive in my hometown in Kentucky. It takes us up the rest of Florida, which, by the way, half of the trip is spent in Florida because Florida is such a long state. Then through Atlanta, Georgia, up past Knoxville, Tennessee, and then finally right past the edges of my hometown, Lexington, Kentucky. All told, we travel about 1,000 miles or 1,500 kilometers, and it takes us about 15 hours, including stops for gas. When we visit my hometown, we stay at my dad's house. He lives in a good neighborhood and has a house big enough to accommodate 5 adults, which includes me and my husband, my dad, and my 2 brothers, a 70-pound dog, and 1 extremely irritable senior cat. I enjoy visiting my hometown because there are several things in my hometown that don't exist in South Florida. Some of these things are restaurants, such as BD's Mongolian Grill, which my husband and I absolutely loved and that we went to twice because it was so good. Some of these things are stores, such as the Peddler's Mall. The Peddler's Mall is a little difficult to describe because it's such an experience. It consists of two huge connected multi-story buildings that are subdivided into spaces, also called stalls, roughly the size of an office cubicle. Each stall is owned by a different person, and each one is essentially its own little shop. People rent the space and can place whatever they want there to sell. Customers roam through the building, browsing through each stall. To be very clear, the owners of each stall are not present. They don't hang out behind a counter and take your money when you buy things from them. Each item in every stall is labeled with a price and the stall number. When you're done shopping, you go to one central counter to pay, and the Peddler's Mall itself makes sure each seller gets paid properly. You can find anything at the Peddler's Mall, from furniture and clothes to handmade candles and signs to food and kids' toys. Honestly, it's just one huge yard sale. I don't know if yard sales exist in your country, but they're very common in the US. A yard sale, sometimes called a garage sale or rummage sale, is when someone sells their unwanted stuff in front of their house, typically in the driveway. My mom loved going to and hosting yard sales when I was a kid, so I can tell you, the Peddler's Mall is essentially one big, permanent yard sale. I personally find Peddler's Mall exhausting simply because of its sheer scale. You could very easily spend hours and hours and hours combing through all the stalls if you were that curious. Unfortunately, I am not. Most of the stuff sold at Peddler's Mall is old. The whole place smells musty. Some people use their stall not to sell stuff, but to use it as cheap storage. However, my husband adores Peddler's Mall. Probably because he didn't spend his entire childhood being dragged around to various yard sales every Saturday morning like I did. So he isn't burnt out on looking through other people's cast-offs. And to be fair, he did find some great stuff there that he probably wouldn't have found anywhere else, and certainly not for such a cheap price. My happy place in my hometown is, of course, the bookstore. Specifically, the used bookstore chain called Half Price Books. Half Price Books does what it says on the tin. Brand new books are half off. And if the book is used, and 95% of them are, it's even cheaper. You can find books there for $1 if you don't mind the condition it's in. We don't have a half price books in Florida. So we spend a decent amount of time there because it's our one chance to stock up for the year. This visit to Kentucky was particularly special this year because in the middle of our time there, we took a small side trip to Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland is about a 5-hour drive from my hometown and sits on the banks of Lake Erie. Now, Cleveland is not known for being a hot destination. So why in God's name would we want to drive 5 hours across the state of Ohio, which is even more boring than driving through Florida? Because of SummerSlam. All right, time for a crash course in entertainment wrestling. Have you ever heard of WWE, NXT, AEW, TNA? Have you heard of The Rock, aka Dwayne Johnson, once the people's champion and now famous Hollywood actor? Maybe you know John Cena, Hulk Hogan? All of this relates to entertainment wrestling. Not wrestling like you'd see in the Olympics. That's real wrestling. Entertainment wrestling is, well, what it sounds like. Wrestling for entertainment. Entertainment wrestling used to be a bit of a niche interest, but now it's become incredibly popular in the US. WrestleMania 40, the biggest wrestling event this year, was a 2-day event that was attended by nearly 150,000 people. SummerSlam is similar to WrestleMania, but not as big. It's the name of the event we attended in Cleveland and the reason we went to Cleveland in the first place, because no offense to anyone from Cleveland or Ohio in general, but there's really no other reason to go to Cleveland. SummerSlam took place in the Cleveland Browns Stadium. Me, my husband, and 2 of our friends were part of the nearly 58,000 people who attended the event in person. Because it was a stadium, it was outdoors, and the weather was perfect. It was in the low 80s Fahrenheit. That's about 28 degrees Celsius. Clear skies with a nice breeze off the lake. We arrived in the evening around 6 o'clock, so the sun was starting to go down right as we took our seats. Here's the thing about a live wrestling event. You're there for the vibes, meaning you don't get the best views because, of course, we couldn't afford the best seats, which easily cost thousands of dollars, and you can't hear the commentary. Also, whoever was controlling the lights at the stadium was a sadist because half of the time, these enormous floodlights were pointed directly into our faces, so we couldn't see anything. But like I said, you're there for the vibes. Being surrounded by thousands of people who love the same thing you do, it's awesome. When we were all blinded by the lights, which is not nearly as cool as The Weeknd makes it sound in his song, we all started chanting, "Turn the lights off," and "We can't see, we can't see." Between matches, the woman next to me, a complete stranger, and I theorized about possible plot twists and complained about the heat together. The moment I sat down, a 10-year-old boy sitting in front of me turned around, looked me straight in the eye, and asked, "Predictions?" Meaning he wanted to know who I thought would win each match. Entertainment wrestling might seem ridiculous to a lot of people. Fair enough. I had the same thought when my husband first tried to get me into it. But I have to say, the fans are cool. It's like being in the biggest book club in the world, but the story is playing out inside a tiny ring in the middle of an enormous stadium packed with tens of thousands of people screaming chants, cheering, and booing, all in equal measure, and the characters enter with heart-pumping background music and pyrotechnics. Needless to say, it was a late night. By the time the four of us trudged back to the parking garage, it was 11:30. By the time we actually got out of the parking garage, because so many people were trying to leave at the same time, it was 1:15, 12:15. By the time I finally fell into my hotel bed, still a little sticky with sweat and utterly exhausted, it was 1 a.m. For someone like me, who normally goes to bed by 9:30, I was way past my bedtime. We had to wake up at 6 a.m. in order to drive 5 hours back to Kentucky to take care of my sick cat. So I was cranky and irritable the entire day. I'm the first to admit I'm beastly when I'm sleep deprived. But man, what an event. And when we got back to my dad's house, we pulled SummerSlam up on the TV and watched the whole thing again. This time with the best camera angles and the commentary. And no, unfortunately, we couldn't see ourselves on camera. Returning to Florida a week later was easier than leaving it. We woke up at 5:30 in the morning, not 2:45, and I was able to drive more than half the way thanks to a Celsius, my energy drink of choice. I'm writing this a few days after we returned to Florida. I'm grateful for another safe, successful trip to my hometown. But I have to say, I am glad to be back in my own house among my books, even if the humidity here is so high that my glasses fog up every time I go outside. That's all for this episode. As always, you can find a link to the transcript in the description. I used a lot of words and expressions in this episode that are explained with example sentences in that transcript. So check it out if you'd like to learn more. Thanks for listening. Until next time, bye.